Right, so Jefferson, the Republican, ran against John Adams, the Federalist. 1800 was the first election where both parties ran candidates and actually campaigned, and surprisingly, the Federalists' elitist strategy of vote for Adams because he's better than you did not work. So Jefferson became president, and his election showed that Americans wanted a more democratic politics, where common people were more free to express their opinions. The Federalists were never really a threat again in presidential politics, and arguably the best thing that John Adams ever did was transfer power in an orderly and honorable way to his rival Jefferson. So in addition to an election, 1800 also saw one of the first large-scale slave uprisings. Gabriel's Rebellion was organized by a Richmond, Virginia blacksmith who hoped to seize the capital, kill some of its inhabitants, and hold the rest hostage until his demands for abolition were met. But the plot was discovered before they could carry it out, and Gabriel, along with 25 other slaves, was hanged. But after the rebellion, Virginians, if they didn't know it already, were very aware that slaves wanted and expected liberty. And the response was predictable. Virginia made its laws concerning slaves much harsher. It became illegal for slaves to meet in groups on Sundays unless supervised by whites, and it became much more difficult for whites to legally free their slaves. But back to Jefferson. His idea was to make the government smaller, lower taxes, shrink the military, and make it possible for America to become a bucolic, agrarian empire of liberty, rather than an English-style, industrial, mercantile nightmare landscape. So how did he do? Well, really well at first. Jefferson got rid of all the taxes except for the tariff, especially the whiskey tax, and then, when he woke up with a terrible, cheap whiskey-induced hangover, he paid off part of the national debt, he shrunk the army and the navy, and basically made sure that America wouldn't become a centralized English-style state for at least the next 60 years. Jefferson appointed Republicans to most government positions, but he couldn't do anything about the Supreme Court because they served for life. And since the country was only like 12 years old, they were all still pretty fresh. Most important among them was Chief Justice John Marshall, who happened to be a Federalist. Marshall was Chief Justice basically forever, and is without question the most important figure in the history of the Supreme Court. He wrote a number of key opinions, but none was more important than the 1803 decision in Marbury versus Madison. Marbury versus Madison is so important because in that decision, the Supreme Court gave itself the power of judicial review, which allows it to uphold or invalidate federal laws. The court then extended this power to state laws in Fletcher versus Peck, and eventually even to executive actions. Like, we think of the main job of the Supreme Court being to declare laws unconstitutional, but that power isn't anywhere in the Constitution itself. Marbury versus Madison gave the court that power, and without it, the Supreme Court would probably be a footnote in American history. So unlike Marshall, Jefferson and the Republicans were big proponents of strict construction, the idea that the Constitution should be read as literally as possible as a way of limiting the power of the federal government. The problem is, there might be things the government wants to do that the Constitution didn't account for, like, for instance, buying a large tract of land from Napoleon, who, as we remember from Crash Course World History, complicates everything. Let's go to the thought bubble. So yeah, Jefferson basically doubled the size of the U.S. in what came to be known as the Louisiana Purchase. What's the problem with this? Well, nothing if you believe in a powerful government that can do stuff that's not in the Constitution, but if you're a strict constructionist like Jefferson, you have to reconcile this obviously beneficial act with there being no mention in the Constitution of the president being able to purchase land in order to expand the size of the U.S. Jefferson imposed the embargo in order to punish Britain for its practice of impressing American sailors, as well as its blockade of France, with whom Britain was once again, or possibly just still, at war. So basically, Jefferson wanted free trade among nations, and his solution was to get Congress to forbid all American ships from sailing to foreign ports. The theory was that the British were so dependent on American primary products like wood and cotton that if we cut off trade with them, the British would stop impressing American sailors and end their blockade. What's the connection between free trade and Jefferson's agrarian ideal? Well, the idea was that America would trade its primary products for Europe's manufactured goods so that the U.S. wouldn't have to develop any manufacturing capacity of its own. Alas, or perhaps fortunately, this did not work. For one thing, Britain and France were too busy fighting each other even to notice America's embargo. So they just continued blockading and impressing. Also, the embargo devastated the American economy. I mean, exports dropped by 80%. Furthermore, not being able to import European manufactured goods only served to spur American manufacturing.